Hi there, welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. Whatever day it is, whether it's morning, evening, or night, I hope you'll find it worth your while to be joining us here. I'm Larry Erickson, I'm your host, and for the next half hour, so almost, I'm going to be talking most of that time about something that I think is actually quite important and that you should be paying some attention to. If you do have any reactions to the show, feel free to email them to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, whoviating at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, which is called Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL for that will be over somewhere around here a couple of times during the show. You can get the email address from there if you didn't catch it, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. Just two things. If you do send me email, please remember to include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is about the show, it's not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer, because just email, I just don't deal with it very well, and I hate answering it, but I do, and you will get an answer to your emails. All right, we always like to start with some good news here where we can, but I've got something today that I honestly can't really call good news, so what I'm going to call it is news to make you smile. A Muslim American non-profit organization called the Sound Vision Foundation. This group aims to, in its own words, and I'm quoting here, provide Muslims with thinking and talking points to manage crises, fight against Islamophobia, and challenge extremism and radicalism among Muslim youth. The group has started a campaign in response to the ongoing Islamophobic bull that Muslims have been silent about Daesh, that is, about ISIS, an accusation that, of course, carries the implication that such silence actually is implicit support for the group. So, you might be driving down a highway outside Chicago, and you may come across this, a giant billboard reading, "Hey ISIS, you suck." Signed, #ActualMuslims. The billboard is part of a campaign called ISIS Sucks that the organization has launched. And the thing is, this really did make me smile. It genuinely made me smile to see that. But I can't call it good news because of the Islamophobia that made it necessary. Lena Suleiman, who's the Director of Creative Engagement at Sound Vision, said the campaign was begun, quote, in light of the constant pressure on American Muslims to condemn ISIS, and that the billboard is, quoting her again, an expression of real human frustration at trying to live peacefully while being associated with a menace that wreaks havoc on mostly other Muslims. Which in fact is true. Most of the victims of Daesh, of ISIS, are themselves Muslim. And in fact, most of the people fighting against Daesh in Syria and Iraq are Muslim. So while the billboard did make me smile, it should not have been necessary to say it. As a footnote to that, 3 researchers recently reported on their efforts to measure the support for ISIS among ordinary Muslims in the Arab world. They added several questions to the now standard Arab Barometer survey to ask a scientifically representative sample of people in 5 Muslim nations, mostly Muslim nations, those being Tunisia, Jordan, the Palestinian territories, Algeria, and Morocco, 3 additional new questions. To what degree do you agree with the goals of the Islamic State? To what extent do you support the Islamic State's use of violence? And to what extent do you believe the Islamic State's use of violence, their tactics, are compatible with the teachings of Islam? The percent agreeing with Daesh's goals range from 0.4% in Jordan to 6.4% in the Palestinian territories. Those agreeing with the use of violence range from 0.4% in Morocco to 5.4% in the Palestinian territories. And those agreeing that the tactics are compatible with Islam range from 1% in Jordan to 8.9% in the Palestinian territories. That is, in none of the nations, on any of the questions, did support for Daesh even reach 9%. And Daesh, to put it mildly, to put it kindly, is not popular among Muslims and in the Arab world. By the way, I'll note in passing that I found it interesting, something worth observing, that in each case, the highest level of support for Daesh was found in the occupied territories of Palestine. The thing is, what makes these findings, though, makes the survey even more significant, is that the researchers allowed for the fact, then, that people might say, I don't know, or refuse to answer a question because they don't want to be seen as supporting Daesh, even if, in fact, they are. So they added the responses, the yes responses, together with the I don't knows and the refuses to answer. And they saw that even if you include the non-answers, even if you assume non-answers are pro-Daesh, the highest level of support for Daesh in any country on any question was 13%, and that was in Algeria on the question of whether or not Daesh's tactics can be compatible with the teachings of Islam, which, in fact, even supporting that, that doesn't mean that you actually support those tactics. The idea that being Muslim means you support, tacitly or otherwise, Daesh or any other form of terrorism is as false in the Middle East and the Arab world as it is here. It is time, it is long past time to stop the bigotry. All right. Now, for the rest of the show, I'm going to be talking about something else. I promised myself last week, I promised you last week, that I would do something about global warming, an important topic about which I have not spoken a great deal recently. Global warming, and by the way, global warming and climate change mean the same thing, okay? I use the terms interchangeably. Some people didn't like the term global warming because they felt it implied, global warming refers to the average temperature of the Earth as a whole, the average surface temperature of the Earth as a whole. And some people didn't like it because they felt the term implied that everywhere would get warmer and to the same amount, to the same degree, which is not true. Some places will get warmer than others, and some places, because of changes in weather patterns, actually might get cooler. So some people didn't like that, so they started talking about climate change, which other people didn't like because they say, well, yeah, the climate is changing, but the phrase climate change doesn't tell you how it's changing, doesn't tell you which direction it changes. We could have global cooling, and you'd still call it climate change. So they both mean the same thing. Each one has its shortcomings. They both refer to the same set of facts, the same information, the same research. They are interchangeable, which is how I use them. So if you come across any of those inane, natty-natty naysayers who talk about, oh, these call it global warming, now it's climate change, ha, 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 go ahead and tell them they mean exactly the same thing. They're synonyms. All right, any event. Global warming, climate change, it's one of those topics that always seems to be like it's percolating in the background, but all too often, in fact, most times, it gets drowned out by the shout of some spiking event or interest. It's kind of like, and to show you how technologically out of touch I am, I'm going to say it's like something that always gets posted on Reddit, but never makes it to the first page. But it is something that should get and maintain our interest because of its importance now and in the future. And contrary to what you might think if you relied on the major media's notion of what's important, which now seems to consist largely of what's the latest inane thing Donald the Rump said and who's ahead in what poll in what state, and a media that, when they can be bothered to address global change, usually it comes down to, they said this, but they said that, as if there really was a balance of scientific opinion. Despite what you would think from all that, global warming, climate change is getting worse. And I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to warn you in advance, I am going to be painting a very dark picture. Let's start with the stark fact that 2015 was the hottest year on the historical record by far, having broken the previous record that was set all the way back in 2014. There are 4 major agencies across 3 nations that track temperature records. Each uses their own data set, each has their own methodology for analysis. Those 4 are NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the United States, which have records dating back to 1880. The Met Office, which is in Britain, it's the United Kingdom's National Weather and Climate Service, they have records dating to 1850, and the Japan Meteorological Agency, whose records date since 1891. All 4 said that 2015 was the warmest year on record by a big margin. And by the way, if you're interested in the U.S. in particular, according to NOAA, 2015 was the second warmest year on record for the lower 48 states, the warmest year being 2012. The thing is, according to NOAA's annual State of the Climate Report, which was released on August 2nd, atmospheric heat was not the only climate record set. 2015 also showed the highest levels of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, the highest sea surface temperatures, the highest level of heat trapped in the upper oceans, the highest ocean levels, and the record low extent of Arctic sea ice. What's more, the levels of heat measured in the first months of 2016 all but guarantee that, barring some dramatic turnaround, 2016 will be even warmer than 2015 and will, in fact, will break that record by even more than 2015 broke 2014's. Meanwhile, glacial melt in Greenland is accelerating, and new research recently published in the peer-reviewed science journal Nature says that Antarctica's vast ice cap is not as stable as was previously thought. Previous forecasts about sea level rise said that the seas could rise as much as a meter, it's a little over 3 feet, by the end of the century. But those predictions did not take into account any melting from Antarctica because it was assumed that increasing snowfall would keep the ice sheet in balance. In other words, that any ice that would be lost would be replaced by increasing snowfall so that the net loss of ice from Antarctica would be zero. This new study reveals that that assumption is wrong, and that unless there is a major reduction in the use of fossil fuels, the actual rise in sea levels by the end of the century could be 2 meters, 6.5 feet, which would swamp many coastal cities around the world. And now, when it has to be considered an ominous event, a long-predicted and feared feedback loop may be making an appearance. Now, a feedback loop, as I'm sure you know, but just in case you don't, a feedback loop is one where the effects of a process cause more of that same process. A happens, it causes B, but B causes more A to happen, which causes more B, which causes more A, and so on and so on. Here, the feared feedback loop is that the warming climate would result in the thawing of the permafrost in the Arctic. Now, permafrost is permanently frozen ground. It's not ice, it's ground. As that ground thaws, soil decomposition accelerates, which releases methane as a natural byproduct. As a greenhouse gas, however, methane is 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But because there's so little of it in the atmosphere compared to the amount of carbon dioxide, it really has not been a major contributor to global warming. But the thing is, as more methane is released, as the permafrost thaws, there's more warming, which melts more permafrost, which releases more methane, and so on, until a tipping point is reached where a self-reinforcing cycle takes place, and we start to get more and more and more this extra powerful greenhouse gas, methane, into the atmosphere. One fear has been the development of methane burps, where instead of the slow release from decomposition, there was a sudden release of methane that had been trapped below the surface, and we're starting to see some indications of that happening. On the remote Bali Island in the Kara Sea off the Yamal Peninsula in Siberia, researchers have found patches of trembling or bubbling grass-covered ground. When the researchers prodded such mounds with their feet, they described them as being like jelly. When the mounds were punctured, they released carbon dioxide at a concentration 20 times above the norm and methane at 200 times above normal concentration. Now, to be accurate, to be completely honest and scientific about it, we cannot say for certain that this is caused by global warming, particularly since there aren't any temperature records for the area to see if Bali Island itself is in fact warming. But it is exactly what you would expect to see if a feedback loop of melting permafrost releasing methane, adding to more warming, was getting underway. After the Paris Climate Summit last December, much was made over provision in the final agreement to set a goal of a maximum increase in global temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial times. That actually is significantly below the previous goal of an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, which really was just a guidepost to try to head off the worst effects. This, we were told, was an indication of how serious the governments of the world were about dealing with global warming. Unfortunately, what it actually was a meaningless exercise in political feel-good. Based on the data gathered by meteorologist Ed Hawkins of Reading University, the average global temperature, when that limit was set at that time, the average global temperature was already 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels, and there were times and places where the increase had actually reached nearly 1.4 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. Researcher and Professor Chris Field of Stanford University said that the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, quote, now looks impossible, or at the very least, very, very difficult. And Andy Pittman, director of the ARC Center of Excellence for Climate System Science at the University of New South Wales in Australia, calls the 1.5 degrees Celsius target wishful thinking, and says, I don't know if you get 1.5 degrees Celsius if you stopped emissions today, because that's because of the inertia in the climate system. In other words, what he's saying is that the stuff that has already been put out there, stuff that's already in the atmosphere, will keep the warming going for some time, even if today, right now, we stop all emissions of fossil fuels. And what's more, even the actual non-binding, they're non-binding, these pledges the nations made, all these nations made to reduce their carbon output, to reduce their release of greenhouse gases, these are all non-binding. But even those non-binding pledges to cut their emissions would, according to the UN's own analysis of these figures, lead to a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, a third higher than the old target and 80% higher than the new one. All we get is talk while the world is sick with fever. And we're going to talk more about that after the break. And we're back. At this point, it's time to take this whole discussion out of like numbers and years and dates and so on, and talk about what global climate change means, and more importantly, will mean to the environment and to the people of the world. Because in fact, global warming is already now wreaking havoc with ecosystems around the world. It has, for one example, triggered the third recorded bleaching of coral. In Australia, 93% of the Great Barrier Reef, which stretches 2,300 kilometers off the shore, 93% of the reefs along the Great Barrier Reef have been affected by bleaching. In the northern parts of the reef, it's believed the majority of the coral is dead. And in some reefs, over 90% of the coral is dying. For another example, the National Center for Atmospheric Research says that climate change has caused a drop in the amount of oxygen absorbed by the oceans. The warmer the water is, the less oxygen it can absorb. The effect is already discernible in some parts of the world in terms of how much oxygen there is in the water, and it should become evident across large parts of the world by the 2030s, which will leave fish, crabs, squid, sea stars, and other marine life struggling to breathe. Some types of fish off the south coast of California are already being affected. They are not considered commercially valuable, so not a whole lot of attention is being paid to that, but they are part of the food chain that supports other marine life in the area. For a third example, consider the Solomon Islands. They are a sparsely populated archipelago of more than 900 islands in the Pacific Ocean east of Papua New Guinea. They are low-lying islands, with the highest point on a lot of these islands no more than several feet above sea level. According to a study published in Environmental Research Letters, 5 of the Solomon Islands have completely disappeared under the ocean since 1947, which was about the time that the dramatic increase in global warming that marked the second half of the 20th century was emerging. The most recent loss of an island came in 2011. Another 6 islands have lost more than 20% of their surface area, forcing people to relocate to higher ground as the water started to lap at their houses. And the islanders actually face the likelihood of having to relocate a provincial capital called Taro. And doing that, however, will involve moving major infrastructure in health, education, sewage, and electricity services, and will cost hundreds of millions of dollars, which the islanders don't have. Those are just 3 examples of changes in climate and ecosystems. Changes which also, these and other changes have other effects on humans beyond loss of habitat. Warming temperatures will allow disease-spreading insects to spread to much wider areas. Threats now confined to the tropics will become problems in the higher latitudes. The American College of Physicians says that climate change is already harming people's health by promoting illnesses related to warmer temperatures and by changing weather patterns. They report that respiratory illnesses, heat stroke, and infectious diseases like the Zika virus, dengue fever, and cholera are flourishing as global temperatures rise. Others point to tick-borne diseases such as babesiosis and Lyme disease. Still others point to anthrax, which killed 2,000 reindeer in 2016 after a 75-year-old carcass thawed. And some people even point to the risk of what they call zombie diseases, bacteria long frozen in the tundra which could still be viable, such as one that was discovered in the Siberian permafrost in 2015, which was still infectious after being frozen for 30,000 years. Rising global temperatures have also been clearly linked to increasing waterborne food poisoning. The bacterium Vibrio, which can make people sick from eating undercooked seafood or from drinking or even swimming in tainted water, is spreading into new regions as the water in those regions starts to warm. And as disease spreads, food shrinks. A recent study conducted by researchers at the University of Oxford predicts that global warming will decimate nutritious crops, killing as many as 500,000 people by the year 2050 as the result of inadequate supplies of fruits and vegetables. Here at home in the U.S., the California drought is probably the best-known local example of the impact of climate change. We've seen the photos of the dried-up marinas and the almost-gone lake beds. But what's less well known is the disparate impact on low-income communities in the state as the impacts of drought deepen and the cost of water goes up. Because, of course, the poor bear the brunt of the impact. And as I'm also going to say, of course, that doesn't happen just here. It happens everywhere. A World Bank report from last fall said that absent aggressive efforts to help the poor, quoting, climate change could result in an additional 100 million people living in extreme poverty by 2030. The report found that people list 3 major factors in why they fall into poverty, quoting, agricultural shocks, including an increase in food prices, natural disasters such as floods, droughts, storms, and health issues, including malaria and diarrhea, all of which come in global warming. The report itself, in fact, referred to studies showing that climate change could result in global crop yields declining by as much as 5% by 2030 and 30% by 2080. That is, the world would be producing 30% less food. And studies showing that warming temperatures could increase the number of people at risk for malaria by 150 million. And it found that the hot spots for climate impacts on poor people were sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. At the same time, Jules Lelyveld, director of the Max Planck Institute for Chemistry and a professor at the Cyprus Institute, says the number of extremely hot days in North Africa and the Middle East, where 500 million people live, has doubled. The number of extremely hot days has doubled since 1970, and the very existence of the inhabitants is at jeopardy. By mid-century, the number of extremely hot days there could rise from the current average of 16 a year to 80, and if fossil fuel use is not cut back, it could reach as many as 200 extremely hot days a year, rendering parts of the region uninhabitable. That's the future we are facing, okay? That's the future we are risking with our inaction. A future of disease, hunger, drought here and floods there, 100 million more people in extreme poverty in sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa, South Asia rather, parts of Northern Africa, the Middle East uninhabitable, all from the heat, coastal cities awash with seawater, and millions, scores of millions of environmental refugees. We are facing, in short, social chaos on an international level. The United Nations Environment Program found that over the last 60 years, at least 40% of all internal conflicts have been linked to the exploitation of natural resources, whether they were high-value resources such as timber, diamonds, gold, or oil or something, or scarce resources such as fertile land and water. Conflicts involving natural resources have also found to be the ones most likely to relapse, that is, to go back to violence and blood. Now that finding, yes, concerned itself with internal conflicts, but are we really going to think that such conflicts over resources such as access to food, to water, to energy, have stopped or would stop at national boundaries? Are we really going to think that the pressure of dealing with a sea of environmental refugees is not going to create a tinderbox of xenophobia, even among the nations that will make an honest attempt to try to deal with them? And if you wonder about that, just consider how quickly the European welcome for Syrian refugees has worn thin. And then realize that the number of people involved in environmental refugees could be many times. They'd be swamped. They would swamp those coming from Syria. And as you contemplate that world of, perhaps just to take a middle guess, that world of 30 to 50 years from now, the world of ecological disruption and social disorder, that world of conflict, of struggle for the basic resources of life and civilization, remember one other thing. There are today, right now, over 5,000 nuclear weapons deployed. Actually deployed. I'm not talking about storage, retired, dismantled, nothing. I'm talking about actually deployed. Over 5,000 nuclear weapons deployed across 9 nations. Now I have, as I said I would, drawn a very dark picture. But it's not a hopeless one. And next week I promise to discuss some of the basis of that hope. Some of the reasons, some social reasons, some political reasons, some technological reasons for that hope. But the truth is, heading off the worst effects of global climate change will require some moderation in the standard of living for those of us in the industrialized world, for those of us who have gathered all the benefits of what is now bringing us down. So for the moment, until next week, I want you to think about where we are headed right now, and I want you to ask yourself a question. Think about, say, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or if you're an old fart like me, think back to the 1960s. Think about what you had then, the level of technology you lived with then, the kind of lifestyle you could have then, and ask yourself if that way you lived was so horrible that you would risk a world to avoid living that way again. That's it for this week. We're out of here. I will see you next week. You have the best week you possibly can. And for now, as always, peace.